the whole story began, roughly speaking, with Aristotle's categories. And Aristotle did not write down his lectures in any form that survived. And so all of the writings that we have putatively by Aristotle are in fact lecture notes by his students. So these lecture notes have been assembled into works, one of which is called the Categories. And what we do when we're doing ontology will be recognizably very similar to what Aristotle was doing in the Categories. So this was perhaps the first diagrammatic representation of Aristotle's categories. So we have substances at the very top, and they divide into two, corporal and incorporeal, and then corporal substances are divided into animate and not animate, and so on down the hierarchy. And ontology, in the sense illustrated by this diagram, was a common feature of philosophical education, and indeed of scientific education, which in those times was not separated clearly from philosophical education, until at least 1606, when the word ontology was introduced into the technical terminology of philosophy as a Latin equivalent of metaphysics, basically. And so ontology is still an Aristotelian activity in just the same way that practically all other branches of philosophy were Aristotelian activities until around 1606. And Linnaeus is doing the same thing in his ontology of the species of organisms. And Linnaeus also, who had an Aristotelian philosophical education, applied the same ideas to diseases, for instance. He created an ontology of diseases, which looks very much like his ontology of species. And the idea that we propound in Buffalo, one of the principles that Werner would be identifying at this point, is that when we do ontology, we are describing reality. And I think that you can all see that Linnaeus, when he was doing ontology, was describing reality. He was not making up concept schemes. He was not describing language. He was describing how the world is structured. So an ontology is something like a window on reality. Now, there are some questions in Aristotle interpretation whether Aristotle was a realist in the sense that I just described. Some people think that the basis of Aristotle's metaphysics is to distinguish not between substances and other things, but between subjects of sentences and what we say about subjects of sentences. But we're going to ignore that issue, which is an interesting issue in the history of philosophy. We're just going to focus on those contributions that Aristotle made, which are realist in the sense that the ontologies which were built by people like Linnaeus in the tradition of Aristotle are windows on reality. Now, reality includes a lot of things, not just animals and diseases. Reality also includes laptops, and it includes databases, and it includes ideas in people's heads. So reality, and it includes language, of course. Language is part of reality. But there's a difference between doing ontology as a description of the way people use language and doing an ontology of things like language as parts of reality. The former sees ontology as secondary to language. Language is the important thing. Ontology is inferred from language. The second sees reality as primary, and language is just another part of reality, just like biology and physics and chemistry and so forth. Now, because we're taping this and because we want the tape to be more or less continuous, we're not going to have very much in the way of question and answer sessions in the course, except when I say so. For instance, now. So are there any questions so far about anything that I've said? Yes?
So with the window and reality, this all seems like it's just taxonomization, really?
Yep. So every ontology will involve a taxonomy like this.
Okay.
But we will find that ontologies, and this may be another principle, ontologies also include other relations. So these relations are what in the ontology jargon these days are called is-a relations. Every primate is a mammal. Every anthropod is a primate, and so on. But there are other relations, such as part of, for instance. Leg, part of human, or human has part brain. And so they are, in principle anyway, extendable to very many different subtypes of relations, which we will be talking about as time goes on. An ontology is a graph, so you can see that there are nodes and edges here, and the nodes are connected to each other by means of the graph. And all the edges here are is-a relation edges. They represent is-a relations in reality. But there will be other edges which represent other kinds of relations in reality. Yep.
I'm not sure this is as much as it's as descendant or something like that. Because the direction of arrows.
Good. So has descendant would indeed be another relation. You may very well be right that this is has descendant.
Like if the arrows were going the other way, is-a would be fine.
Okay, good. So yes, so you're right. It's not is-a, but has subspecies or something like that.
Or subsumes.
Subsumes.
Subsumes, that's it.
Very often we talk about parent-child relationships. All right, now we have Linnaeus, who is a great hero in the history of ontology, and then we have Darwin. And Darwin is, in many circles, regarded as having demolished the stature of Aristotle and entered a new era, in biology at least, an era in which the old Aristotelian way of doing biology, by identifying species and genera as being, as people sometimes say, fixed eternally, and substituted a new view of biology according to which there are no eternally fixed species, but rather populations which are evolving and changing continuously, and some species then go extinct, new species evolve, and the consequence which is often drawn is that Darwin showed that ontology is no longer an appropriate way of doing biology. Now, first of all, that's probably unfair to Aristotle. Aristotle does indeed, in some places, talk as if he thought that there was a fixity of species, that all the species were all eternally present and all eternally the same. But there are other places where Aristotle recognizes something like the possibility of species going extinct and of species being born. So it's an interesting question in the history or the exegesis of Aristotle, whether he believed in the fixity of species. But the issue that we have to face today is one which arises independently of whether species are fixed. If species evolve, there is still a role to play, and biologists are playing this role all the time in determining whether two organisms are of the same species, for instance, or how evolution occurs. How is one species initiated in the course of evolutionary history? These are questions which biologists raise, and in raising them they are using an ontology of species, just not an ontology of species conceived as an eternally correct map of a certain graph theoretic hierarchy. And another important feature of modern biology, anyway, is that there are many other areas in biology where ontologies are being developed very, very intensively. And this is because of the rise of bioinformatics, chemistry informatics, genome biology, proteome biology, and many other branches of biology which deal in ontologies in a very, very systematic and very, very ambitious way. And the big success story in modern ontology, one of the main reasons why ontology is such an important branch of scientific activity these days, is because of the Human Genome Project, which we would say introduced a new golden age of classification, that Darwin didn't destroy biological classification. Rather, he was one of the people who showed the way to modern biology, where classifications are indispensable. Now, so we have all of these classifications and many more. There are disciplines corresponding to each of these classifications, branches of biology, many more disciplines in addition to genomics and proteomics and pharmacogenomics and bibliomics, which is the study of biological literature from an ontological point of view. So all of these new disciplines are building ontologies as maps of the kinds or categories in the relevant domain of biology. And the problem then is that different biologists and people also doing different kinds of biochemistry are slicing the world into categories in different ways. And we get questions about how these various different maps of categories created by these different disciplines are to be unified together, because science is interested in unification. Science cannot tolerate two incompatible propositions. It has to find a way of unifying the incompatible propositions to discover scientific laws which everyone will accept, or scientific truths which everyone will accept. So this is where ontology as what we might think of as a meta-scientific discipline comes into play. So the problems being studied by proteomics or by genomics or by cell biologists are problems within proteomics and genomics and cell biology. How many cell types are there? What kinds of cell types are there? What are the subtypes? These are biological questions, the answer to which is a biological ontology. But then if we take all of these biological ontologies and we say, how do these biological questions relate, how do these biological ontologies relate to each other? We're not doing genomics or proteomics or cell biology anymore. We are doing something else which we might call ontology. And that's one way of understanding what this class is all about. Ontology at this higher theoretical level is about questions like, how do these biological ontologies relate to those chemistry ontologies, for instance? And that's why it is that I am a philosopher, or I used to be a philosopher. I now prefer to think of myself as an ontologist. I became an ontologist as a result of working with biologists. I started working with biologists because I realized roughly 20 years ago that the philosophical work I was doing in ontology, which was not about biology or computers or chemistry or anything, it was about ontology in the traditional philosophical sense, that the work I was doing was being used by computer scientists who were working on ontologies in bioinformatics or in computer engineering or in other areas. And so I started to explore what they were doing, and I realized that there was indeed a way in which the questions at the higher level about how ontologies relate to each other could be answered by somebody who knew about philosophy. And I began this communication by interacting with an Italian ontologist by the name of Nicola Guarino, who founded the world's first Institute of Ontological Research. Guarino is a doctor of engineering, which is a very prestigious status in Italy, much more prestigious than in the United States. And I visited him, and we exchanged ideas, we argued, and we influenced each other. He says that I influenced him to stop thinking of himself as an engineer and to start thinking of himself as a philosopher. I see our interactions as having influenced me to stop thinking of myself as a philosopher and to start thinking of myself as an engineer.
So who of the two is the wisest?
I don't know the answer to that question. Do you know
I
the?
don't want to know the answer. He's saying that we know the answer.
I don't know the answer.
Well, starting to think as a philosopher, I think is better. So my saying is always that engineers try to make things work. Ontologists try to do it right.
I want to have my cake and eat it. I want to have something that's right and that works because it's right.
That's a better approach, yes.
And that doesn't make me a philosopher, it makes me a realist in the philosophical sense.
But not a typical engineer.
No. But Guarino is. Okay. All right, so another feature in all of
That was
this.
an important principle. Small discussion.
Another feature in all of this, we've already just mentioned engineering in general, but computer engineering specifically. So if we just have biologists creating ontologies, then they'll work really hard to create ontologies which are compatible with each other. But unfortunately, the Human Genome Project brought about a situation where biologists needed to work with computer engineers because the genome is so huge that you can't navigate through the genome or the proteome or any of the other omes without computers. And computer engineers are, I've nearly said criminally, but let's say dangerously interested in creating things that work, even if this is clearly at the expense of what we might call ontological correctness or ontological rectitude. And so what happened in biology when computer science became involved is that there were many, and this is true not just of biology, but also of medicine. When computer scientists became involved in the day-to-day business of examining data, collecting data, processing data, then they preferred to use various kinds of shortcuts in order to be able to use the tools the computational tools which they had at their disposal to make progress, to make things which work. So you can understand why they made these shortcuts. Biology is very difficult. If you simplify it somewhat, you're more likely to produce a workable computer framework, and that's what they did. But that created, in accumulation, over a very short span of time, so we're talking 10, 15 years, chaos. And it's at this point that the word criminal becomes really appropriate. So there was no control on the kinds of data structures which the computer scientists who became involved in biology and in medicine started to build. Again, there is some justification for this. This was completely new. It was a new world that they were creating. There were no standards which they could appeal to. They had to invent everything from scratch. And the problem was, and this is the reason why ontology is so important today, the problem was that they all invented slightly different solutions, which means that instead of having 10 big biological and medical databases which need to be connected together, you have hundreds of thousands, because every computer lab does it slightly differently. And so they create silos. And these silos need then to be brought back together again. And that's an ontologist's job. So the answer to this problem is to work out how to do it right, and then tell all the computer scientists to stop inventing new stuff and just do it in the same way as everyone else does it, namely in the right way. And fortunately, we know how to do it right here in Buffalo. I used to say this, I even published a paper on this, because we have a direct fax. In the old days we had fax machines. Now I would say we have a direct email connection with Aristotle. Now that is a simplification, but still that is really the core of what we do in Buffalo. We build ontologies on the basis of well-tested philosophical principles, and we try and persuade computer scientists to build ontologically related artifacts along the same lines, so that they all do it in the same way. And there's a lot more to what we do than Aristotle, but Aristotle is still lying there in the core of what we do. All right. Now, one simple way of understanding an ontology is that it's a bit like a dictionary, but it's a dictionary which is designed to be used by computers. And we have here a technical definition. So an ontology, I said, is a picture of reality, or a map of reality, or a window on reality. Here we say it's a representation. But now it's not a representation of particulars. So remember the pictures of Linnaeus and so forth. It's a representation of the kinds or types or universals in reality. So that's the difference between an ontology and most databases, or between an ontology and a telephone directory. Ontology is not about instances, it's about kinds. And what is an ontology for? Well, many people collect lots of data. The data are about the same kinds of things, and the ontology is there to make sure that the people collecting the data relate those kinds of things to each other properly. And so how does ontology have this magic power to relate the kinds of things which databases are about? Why couldn't the database people do it themselves? Why do they need the help of ontologists? The answer is that database engineering, for various reasons, uses all kinds of codes. And these codes might be alphanumeric strings, or they might be acronyms, or they might be shortened forms of words. And part of the reason for this is because screens in the olden days, which is 10 years ago still, were small. And so you needed short words so that you could see your whole database on one single screen. And the big problem with coding systems is that they can be changed very quickly. They change all the time, so that people forget the meanings of the codes that they themselves created just 1 year earlier. Ontologies are not made of codes. Ontologies are made of nouns and noun phrases, ideally, of course, in English, but we don't mind if people build ontologies in other languages. And these nouns and noun phrases, because they're part of the English language, they change hardly at all. So the word cell is still recognizably the same word when used by a cell biologist now as it was 100 or 200 years ago, where a code for cell in a database might mean a dozen different things depending on who put the database together. So ontologies are stable, but the way we build them, you can add new branches quite easily. And databases are not stable, and it's very hard to, because people build new ones all the time, but they're also not extendable. Database software makes it very difficult to add a new column to a database if it's part of a database system, where ontologies find it very easy to add new branches, as we will see. All right, and then ontologies are meant to be at a higher level, above communities, above companies, above industries, above sciences, scientific disciplines, where databases, they are built by local groups. One enterprise will have its own database system. And so this is another reason why we can anticipate, if we do the job properly, that well-built ontologies will be able to unify databases built at different times and by different people. All right, now before I start on the history of modern ontology, are there any questions? Yes?
So, what are the criteria by judging that an ontology is true? If it's just like how it works, how is that different from building the
Yep.
other kind of ontology?
Good. So, first of all, databases are very often built by computer scientists for people working in other areas, and they are not typically experts in the areas which they're building the databases for. The successful ontologies in biology, for instance, which is really the best example of a success story in biology, in ontology, were built by biologists. And they were built by biologists who were at the cutting edge of the new genomic biology. And so they were true or correct in the same sort of way that we say that scientific theories are true or correct. They were based on empirical evidence, they were based on the most recent research, and so on. So that's the strategy. We build the ontology to represent reality as it's represented by the best established science. And as we will see, some of the ontologies that we're concerned with are outside science, but something similar applies there. Any other questions? No? All right. So let's look at some history now. So I talked about Aristotle. Nothing happened between Aristotle and 1970 that is of any importance. Well, the Vienna Circle did some work which looks a bit like ontology. And they called it the unification of science. They were trying to unify science, but they used first-order predicate logic as the vehicle for unifying science. And we will see that that's not necessarily the right vehicle. You might say that where the Vienna Circle used propositions and formal theories involving propositions to unified science, the ontologists use nouns. We have controlled vocabularies of nouns and noun phrases joined together by edges in a graph, and that's how we unify science. All right, in 1970 in Stanford, round about 1970, a group of people started using the word ontology in the context of computer science, particularly artificial intelligence. And they got the word from Quine. So they were sufficiently interested in logic. They knew what philosophers were like Quine were saying about logic, and they saw that Quine was arguing that the way you understand what a scientific theory is about is to formalize the scientific theory using first-order predicate logic and then see what that theory is committed to. So what must there exist for that theory, that formal theory, to be, what must exist in the world for that formal theory to be true? That was a question. And Quine coined the phrase ontological commitment to mean a statement of those things which must exist for a certain scientific theory to be true. So a theory about electrons is ontologically committed to electrons. A theory which is about people is ontologically committed to the existence of people. Now, we have scientific theories which are ontologically committed to certain things, and we can say the ontology of this scientific theory consists of cells, cell parts, membranes, nuclei, and so on. That's the ontology. And now they wanted to do artificial intelligence. That meant that they wanted to build computers that would be able to simulate what ordinary human beings do when they are engaging with everyday reality. And the tool that they chose was first-order predicate logic. And so they said, well, if Quine takes the first-order predicate logic formalization of a scientific theory as a way of defining the ontology of that theory, then we can take a first-order predicate logic representation of common sense, human everyday knowledge, and work out the ontology of common sense, of folk ontology, or naive ontology, by looking at that formal theory. And in this way, the word ontology became part of the technical vocabulary of computer science. Now, the first work was in areas like robotics. So a man called Patrick Hayes was really the first person to build an ontology of something in the ordinary world of common sense. And it was an ontology of liquids. And he was building the ontology of liquids to help robots navigate a world in which there are things like glasses of water, or lakes, or rivers, or thermometers. And so he built a large first-order predicate logic axiom set about liquids and called it the ontology of liquids. Now, one of the people in this group was called Tom Gruber, and he is probably the most well-known ontologist. So his definition of ontology was for a long time the definition that people liked to cite. He invented Siri, which is the system in your iPhone that answers questions. So you all have many ontologies in your pocket without realizing it. Now, people realized that first-order predicate logic is not going to be a good way of doing artificial intelligence, because first-order predicate logic is not decidable. And if you're going to build a robot that can navigate through the world, it has to be able to decide whether to go left or right, depending on what the robot sees. So it has to be able to do calculations quickly, and for that you need a decidable logic. First-order predicate logic is not decidable. And so between 1970 and 1990, the DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, something like that, tried to build a logical system which would be able to support what they called knowledge interchange, which was a term they used for exchanging knowledge between robots and humans, and between robots and robots, and between robots and databases and so on. In other words, a logical tool which would enable robots to do thinking on the fly, which would be weaker than first-order logic, but quicker than first-order logic in allowing calculations. And eventually, out of that DARPA-funded work, there arose something called the ontology, the Web Ontology Language, or OWL, which was part of an initiative called the Semantic Web, which was led, amongst other people, by Tim Berners-Lee, who viewed it as the new internet. So the core of the new internet was supposed to be ontology. And that's still, in a way, the case, but unfortunately they chose the wrong kind of ontology. And they chose, as a paradigm for the way the new internet would be linked together, a very, very weak paradigm which said that you just need lots and lots of ontologies. Some of them can be good, some of them can be bad, but providing they're all linked together, this will be wonderful. And it was not wonderful. It was just a nice pictorial hairball representing the chaos I talked about before. And during this period, various people started to apply ontology to different areas, not just science, but also engineering. So 1995 sees a wave of engineering ontologies, but again, everybody built their engineering ontologies slightly differently from everybody else. And so the engineering ontologies never did any useful purpose because they were not connected to other engineering ontologies. And then we have Protégé, which you will be learning about in the course of this class. Protégé is an ontology word processor. And you'll learn how to use ontology. If you want to Google ontology and start playing with it, then you are welcome to do so. But we will have a class explaining how you go about building ontologies using Protégé. And the first release version of OWL came into being in 2004, and we'll talk a little bit about OWL in the course of this class. But neither Werner nor I are OWL aficionados. So OWL is the de facto standard language that people use to build ontologies. You should know about it. But we believe that there are more important issues to be addressed in a course like this. And we will fill in any necessary gaps as we go by. And if you have questions about OWL, you should raise them. But it won't be a central feature of this class. All right, now, as I say, biology was the real success story. Biology is not on this list. This is the generic ontology background. Ontology, as it formed an important part in the history of computer science and artificial intelligence. Now, I've already said some of this, but Protégé brought about a rather sad consequence that it became easy for people to build ontologies. And so of course, everybody started building ontologies. So you have dozens of ontologies of rock music, because lots of people want to collect rock music albums, and an ontology is a nice way to classify your different rock music singers and bands, and I don't know. And so this linked open data idea truly did create a hairball, with dozens of rock music ontologies up here and dozens of bioscientific ontologies down at the bottom, and then in the middle you have Wikipedia ontology and so forth. And it looks very nice, and there are some people who truly can use it because they're good at hacking. But it's not a coherent way of resolving the problem of unifying data in many databases. So, when too many people start building ontologies, people stop trusting ontologies. When too many people start building ontologies, the ontologies themselves become mutually redundant, so they overlap, which means there are all kinds of confusions, because people think they're using a term from one ontology, other people think they're using the same term, but they're getting it from a different ontology where it has a different definition, and so you make the problem of database incompatibility worse. And you bring about then ontology winter. And people say, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with ontology anymore. For a time, the Air Force embargoed the word ontology in any Air Force document because they were sick to the teeth of people coming up with new ontologies, which were just slight variations on things which had already failed. And this is about 2005. Too much inconsistency, no common methodology. We now have OWL, which is it's a common language which does bring some benefits. And slowly, people are, and this is why Buffalo is the Silicon Valley of ontology, people are beginning to recognize that there is one way of ensuring that you are following something like best practices, which is to use something called BFO, which stands for Basic Formal Ontology. And so a lot of this course will be devoted to BFO. And BFO is, again, a little bit like Aristotle's categories. It's about 3 times larger than Aristotle's categories. It overlaps to some degree with Aristotle's categories, and it has the same goal, namely, to be the mother of all sciences. Now, I'll just show you the kind of problem. So I'm working with the military, trying to solve ontological problems in military data, military and military intelligence data. And the military has recognized this problem for years. They realize that they have a big problem because they have too many databases, catalogs, inventories, repositories, all of which were built separately by different agencies, all of which are catalogs or inventories of the same things, but because they were built differently, they don't work together, and so they can't answer questions. So it's probably still impossible to determine on any given day how many people are working for the Department of Defense and how many of them are on holiday, because it's all collected in hundreds of different data systems which don't talk to each other. So how to solve this problem? They have an answer, which is formulated in Department of Defense instruction number 8320.02. all authoritative data sources must be registered in the DoD data services environment. This will solve the problem, they think. And then they give, so DSE contains the structural and semantic metadata artifacts critical to successful, and so on. That's what they say. So let's see how it works. This is one example of an ontology, I guess you could call it, which is included in the DSE. And so it must be good. It must have all the essential semantics and metadata that you require. This is called the Acquisition Community Connection, which is an artifact created to help the Defense Department buy stuff. It's important to have a good ontology for doing that. Otherwise, you might buy the same thing twice under different names, for instance, which of course they never do. And part of the stuff that they buy are database architectures of various kinds. And so they have a small sub-ontology within this acquisition community connection, which is an ontology of data systems and data architectures. And these are some examples of terms which are in this ontology. One term is in there twice, which is already suspicious. And they have definitions for all of these terms. The problem is that they took their definitions from different sources, which is not a good idea, because the definitions are meant to explain meanings in compatible ways so that you can know whether you're dealing with one thing or another thing. So they took them from the Naval Open Architecture is a noun, which the definition of which they took from a Navy publication called Rumlines. And anyway, you can see where these things came from. And so the term architecture is defined as the fundamental organization of a system embodied in its components. The term integrated architecture is defined as multiple views or perspectives. And then there's a bit more. But you can see we're on a dangerous road here if what we're interested in is interoperability. And then a system architecture is defined as the composite of the design architectures for products and their life cycle processes. Now this might be a nice definition of something, but it has nothing to do with architecture as defined or with integrated architecture. And then an open system architecture is a system that employs modular design. Now, this is a bad way of building something which is supposed to capture the metadata to enable the stuff that you buy be clearly distinguished into relevant classes within a classification. So gradually, and I don't know if this was because of my badgering them about what they were doing, they killed it. So it's called a program sunset. They killed it. They said, no, we're not going to do it this way anymore. I do not know what they're doing as an alternative yet, but I do know how you should have done what they were trying to do. So if you want to define, for instance, open system architecture, then first of all you need to define architecture. And I won't worry about how you do that. We'll just assume that we have a good definition of architecture. And then you define integrated architecture as an architecture which is integrated. That's a really good starting point. In fact, that's probably all you need. Providing you have a good definition of architecture, then a good definition of integrated architecture is an architecture which is integrated. Just as a good definition in Aristotle's day of human is an animal which is rational. This is called definition by genus and specific difference. You define a term A by looking at what its parent term is in a species-genus hierarchy, and then by specifying what is the specific difference which makes those instances of the parent term instances of the child term, and thereby differentiates them from all the other instances of the parent term. So that's what we do here. A system architecture is an architecture of a system. An open system architecture is a system architecture which is open. When you do that, you immediately get a really nice ontology. in which everything fits in its proper place. Now, the first lesson that we can draw here is that ontology is not rocket science. Ontology is defining nouns carefully and drawing corresponding graph-theoretic conclusions. And it turns out that a lot of mileage can be gained from doing ontology in this very simple defining nouns strategy, using the Aristotelian way of creating definitions. All right, so this is the parallel story of ontology in the life sciences, which was, practically speaking, independent of the development within computer science. So it was not computer scientists who were involved in this. The Human Genome Project was not just the Human Genome Project, it was a fly genome project, a fish genome project, a yeast genome project, and so on. There were hundreds. Now there are, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of genomes which exist. And they were built with the help of computer engineers, usually computer engineers with some biological background, by biologists and chemists. So it was a wet lab project to a significant degree. In 1999, a group of leaders of these model organism communities. A model organism is an organism used as a model for a human. So if you want to study human muscle development, do experiments on how muscles develop in humans, you can't do anything to examine the muscle being developed in the embryo, for instance, but you can do that with a mouse. So mice are used as models of humans for doing experiments. If you have the human genome and the mouse genome, you'll find that there are lots of similarities. Because of those similarities, you can infer information from experiments on mice to corresponding information about the same development processes or disease processes or drug impact processes in humans. And thereby, you can do a much more sophisticated kind of human biology with the aid of experiments on non-human model organisms. The problem is that the way in which biological phenomena are described in the mouse world and in the fish world and in the yeast world is different from the way the same things are described when you're doing human biology. In order to enable this kind of model organism biology to succeed, therefore, you needed a common terminology, a computable terminology, to describe biology across species. So you need a species-neutral biological vocabulary, which you can then use to tag gene sequence data. You can say this sequence in mouse is part of the entity which this gene sequence in the mouse genome refers to is involved in the process of mouse muscle development. And this gene sequence, which is a very similar gene sequence in the human genome, represents an entity which is involved in human muscle development. And for that, you need a term, muscle development, which can be applied both to the human and to the mouse cases. In 1999, a group of model organism biologists, led by a man called Michael Ashburner, created the gene ontology, which is still by far the most successful scientific ontology that there is. And the gene ontology is a computable lexicon, a controlled, structured vocabulary for describing in old-fashioned biological terminology, but in a species-neutral way, the attributes of genes and proteins, gene products. Sequence data, in other words. You use the gene ontology to tag sequence data. Now, once the gene ontology was created, it was realized that it was only partially sufficient because the gene ontology doesn't contain disease terms. It doesn't contain anatomy terms. It doesn't contain environment terms. And so a series of other ontologies were created, which formed a suite of ontologies called OBO. At this point, I became involved in the work of the Gene Ontology Consortium and the OBO group. And in 2004, as a result of this interaction, we created something called Basic Formal Ontology in the very early version. And the Basic Formal Ontology is really just the top level of the gene ontology, or it's something like the top level of the gene ontology, as we will see. In other words, the biology neutral level, completely general. It contains terms like object or process. All right, and then BFO gradually became established as the top-level hub from out of which various ontologies were built as spokes. So you start with BFO, and then you create more specific terms by populating downwards. And we'll see how this works in due course. And now there are more than 300 ontology groups who are using BFO in this way, which is by far the most widely used method for building ontologies now, to start with BFO and build downwards, in the same way that we started with architecture and built downwards to get to open system architecture. And this is a paper in which we formulated the principles which underlie successful ontology development. And you see that Michael Ashburner is the second author on this paper. And Werner is, Werner is number 7, it's number 6, but then it's alphabetical after the first 3, which are me, Ashburner, and Ross. Cornelius Ross is a great ontologist of anatomy. And there are some more authors, so you can see that ontology goes hand in hand very often with multi-authored papers, because ontology is part of science, where philosophy goes hand in hand with single-authored papers, and I won't explain the reason for that. All right. And then in 2015, we published a textbook for building ontologies using basic formal ontology. And in chapter 4, you'll find a set of rules for definitions which overlap with the principles that we're looking for in your assignment this week. All right, any questions? Are there, so am I going too slowly? Is all of this obvious to all of you? Am I going too quickly for anybody? Yes?
I'm not exactly sure what you're looking for when you say, like, we have to, like, give you, like, these principles. I'm not exactly sure
So
what...
you can
okay.
address this to them.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just not exactly sure what is just, like, good information about ontologies and what the principles are. These are principles for building ontologies that you're looking for? Or?
Yeah, for building the ontologies and how you use them.
Okay.
And what requirements need to be fulfilled for them to be usable.
All right.
So he said a couple of lines. Usually, when you use like shall or should, that are important clues.
Oh, okay.
So if you go to the website, so that I created a website on the Buffalo University web server, pointing to this book, you will find a table, an expanded table of contents, and the table of contents for chapter 4 consists of a set of short statements of rules for writing definitions. Many of those statements are going to be relevant to the question of principles, because writing definitions is a large part of the way in which you build an ontology.
I wanted to react, but I didn't. So when you were talking about your architecture, So you said architecture and then system architecture and open system architecture. So now you get a nice ontology. Okay, let's start with dragon and then Chinese dragon and stuff. There's a difference between defining your terms in the way about the dragons and in the way of the architecture. And in some way, I mean, you can even make the same comment about the architecture. Right? What if you define an open system architecture at a point of time that there are no open system architecture?
Okay, I think we need to introduce this question.
Yeah.
So, I guess a good way of doing it would be to go back to our friend Nicola Guarino. So, Nicola started off as an engineer, but when he began to build ontologies, he got involved with the wrong crowd. He got involved with linguists who were interested in the fertility of language to create new kinds of entities. And this fertility of language is illustrated in mythology or in fiction, poetry. And you can build ontologies for mythical creatures, for instance, or for Greek gods, or for characters in Sherlock Holmes. And from the perspective of Nicola Guarino's group, this kind of ontology is just the same, is ontology in just the same sense as the kinds of ontologies which are being built for the Human Genome Project related work. Now, we see those ontologies as being not ontologies at all because there is no reality which they are depicting. There are no dragons, there are no unicorns, there are no Greek gods, and there never were any Greek gods. People were under the false belief that there are Greek gods. Yes?
So you said before though that things like language and ideas maybe
Yeah.
were part of reality.
Yeah.
Would you still have a way to account for like a unicorn as a fictional entity within a real ontology?
So this is a real problem, but the quick and not quite precise answer is that we can describe works of fiction, they are part of reality. We can describe the references in works of fiction, we can describe people's beliefs, but we can't describe Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is not an instance of any ontological type, because Sherlock Holmes is not. There is no Sherlock Holmes. He's not an instance of the type fictional character either, from a realist point of view, the sort of the emperor.
Okay. But wouldn't Sherlock Holmes at least be a concept? Like I have a concept of Sherlock Holmes. Surely you could like have an ontology category of concept or something
Yes,
similar.
so concept is a very important word in our discussions. Let me back up a little bit and describe the role of the word concept. I'm trying not to use the word, I'm mentioning it always. So when Tom Gruber put forward his definition of ontology, and that was really the most influential definition of ontology in the whole literature, he defined an ontology as the specification of a conceptualization. So you have a conceptualization of planets, he has a conceptualization of planets. In your conceptualization, planets are heavenly bodies which orbit around the sun. In his conceptualization, planets are holes in the what's the word? The deck, the arch or the arc of the heavens. So the light shines through these holes. Now, he has a conceptualization, you have a conceptualization, and to specify each of those conceptualizations would be to create an ontology according to Tom Gruber's view. And this is a view which fits very nicely into the community of people who are interested in common sense. So you're going to see films, you're interested in Star Wars, you're interested in animals on the planet Klingon and so on. You really need ontologies for those things if you're going to use Siri properly. And so Gruber tended to be a little bit open in the way that Guarino tended to be a little bit open in the in regard to what he counted as an ontology. Now, that same openness applied also in medicine. And here it worked in a somewhat different way. So let's suppose I think that you have diabetes, but he thinks that you have some kind of mental disease, psychiatric disease. So you just like to inject yourself. I have my concept, he has his concept, and both of those concepts are perfectly good concepts, and so we should put them in our ontology of medical phenomena. And this will be helpful because when you're a beginning medical student, very often you have confused concepts. You may think that diabetes involves the addiction to insulin injections. And it's good that we can take care of those unformed, confused concepts, as they say, in a single ontology. And then also we have Chinese medicine and we have African medicine, and they have their own concepts. And the result was that the medical ontologies that were built under this so-called concept orientation tended to be somewhat bloated, because they included, for what seems to be one and the same physical disorder, multiple different conceptualizations. And this led to various interesting confusions. So one confusion is represented by the world's most important medical ontology, which is run as a massive multi-government enterprise, called the Systematized Nomenclature for Medicine, SNOMED, which is demons backwards. And SNOMED is an ontology of disease phenomena. So you might think, well, what's going at the very top? What is the root node of SNOMED? Well, the answer is it's concept. And so you have things like headache is a concept, disease is a concept, surgical procedure is a concept. Now, when I have a headache, I don't have a concept. I have something which is real. And SNOMED has officially realized, and I think this is provably as a result of our, namely Werner and my badgering of SNOMED, that this is absurd to say that a disease is a concept. They have now issued a health warning which says, danger, when you use SNOMED, you should be aware that the word concept, it has 3 different meanings, and then they give a neutral meaning for the concept as the root node, which at least solves some of the problems. It's still not good practice what they do. That would be a principle. Don't put something like concept at the top of your ontology. The gene ontology, originally, before I came along, and here my badgering also was successful, originally the top node of the gene ontology was gene ontology. So cell membrane is a gene ontology. That was a mistake. And as soon as I pointed it out, they realized it was a mistake. So it didn't take them a millisecond to realize that they were doing something wrong. So another example in the same vein. So very often people confuse the thing with the concept. So what the term banana in an ontology is about is the concept banana. We say it's about the type or kind or universal banana. Very often ontologists use definitions like this. Mouse is defined as the name of the organism mus musculus. So in other words, now they confuse the type in reality with the name of the type. And they do that, literally they confuse the two. They tell us that they are confused by saying that a mouse is the name of a mouse. And that's a very common error. Now, again, we badgered, and so those kinds of errors are now gradually going away. And a statistical paper was published a couple of years back on the controversy or the debate between the concept orientation and the ontological realist orientation, which Werner and I are known for in medical informatics. And they did a statistical study of the influence of the two orientations, and they showed that the concept orientation is going down in its influence, and our orientation is now over the point where we are more dominant. We're not completely dominant by any means, but we're more dominant than the other orientation.
So another issue if I may add is that in some cases biologists are not sure yet about whether there is really an entity that they nevertheless strongly believe that it would exist. For instance, like gene. Okay, so there is still not a uniformly accepted definition for what a gene exactly is. So originally it started like as a sequence of amino acids in the DNA, and then they discovered it's not necessarily consecutive, and it might even be on different places, and now they don't know it anymore. Nevertheless, the concept of gene is very useful because it advanced science quite a lot. But if you look at it from the die-hard realist perspective, as me and Barry do, it shouldn't be in an ontology because they are not sure yet what it is precisely. Okay, so
and you have to remember that the gene ontology is not an ontology of genes. It's an ontology of old-fashioned biology. And another point related to what Werner just made is that very often when a new disease appears, people don't know what it is. So SARS, for instance, now they know what SARS is, what causes it. But when it first appeared, they didn't know what it is, but they knew that there was this disease with all these features. And so there too, they're tempted to say, well, we have this concept, but we don't. We have something going on in the world which we will identify in due course as involving this and this disorder, involving the coronavirus and so on. So in each of the cases where the word concept seems to be attractive to use in order to understand how people are using general terms, we believe that there is a more careful way of understanding how people use general terms, which does not involve ontological commitment to anything which would deserve to be called a concept. I think I did use it a couple of times during the last few paragraphs, but I have a very useful prophylactic recommendation, which is that anybody who uses the word concept in my presence has to pay me $1. And if I use it, and I didn't use it just then, I just mentioned it. If I use it, I have to pay you $100. So that starts now. All right. So these are just features of BFO which distinguish it. So there are other small ontologies, including the ontology of Nicola Guarino, which is called Dolce, which it doesn't stand for sweet. It stands for Descriptive Ontology for Linguistic and Cognitive Engineering. I think that this is an example of bad name choice where you have the acronym before you have the name. So it's a backronym. It evolves very slowly. It's going through a big evolutionary phase just at the moment because it's being validated to become an ISO standard. And you can read the rest. So we have a lot of people who know how to use BFO. Unfortunately, also we have a lot of people who use BFO but don't know how to use it, but that's life. So we have many ontologies which reuse BFO. They're built by this process of downward population. I mentioned the ISO standard, so in due course it will be ISO standard 21838-2. And -1 is as requirements for being a top-level ontology. Now, I talked about the hub and spokes idea. So one of the reasons why BFO is so much reused is because it's a plug-and-play module that you can plug into many different domains and build ontologies from it. And the idea is, and this was the idea created by Obo, that you have different disciplines or different areas of scientific research, such as cell biology or immunology or endocrinology, each of those groups has experts who need an ontology. But they want to build their ontologies so that they all interoperate with each other, so that they can exchange data using the ontology, they can combine data. And if they use the same top-level ontology, then they'll have more success than if they just did it themselves and created their own top-level ontology, which some people still do, but gradually it's becoming less tempting. So you get the division of labor because endocrinologists can focus on the endocrinology part of endocrinology ontology, and BFO focuses on the strictly ontological part of the work that they have to do. And you get a division of authority. Some people are in charge of BFO, other people are in charge of the endocrine ontology. And you get subject matter expert ownership. So there is just one endocrinology ontology, and it's owned by the people who know about endocrinology, who are really keen to make sure that it maintains its status as the best ontology in endocrinology there is, and so they make sure that it is maintained properly and used properly and managed properly and so on. And because there is only one endocrinology ontology, everybody knows where to find it. Where if there were 17, then there would be a problem of which one you choose, because some of them might be good and most of them will inevitably be bad. And also this means that you have a way of building ontologies incrementally. You can build the endocrinology ontology, and then you can build the pediatric endocrine ontology as an extension of the endocrine ontology. And in this way also we reduce the need for mapping. So if you have 17 endocrinology ontologies, you're going to need to map them to each other somehow. And if you just have one linked to all the other ontologies for different disciplines through a common hub, then you will not need to have mappings. You will still need some mappings because of legacy data. SNOMED, for instance, will be around forever. Has infinite funding for all posterity from 15 governments. They're only paying out $15 million or so per year, but for all posterity, so it adds up. Now, another division that we need to think about is the division between what we call reference ontologies and application ontologies. So the gene ontology is a reference ontology. It's reused by thousands of people. And it's reused by hundreds of ontologies. It's designed to be reused. It's like a scientific textbook. It's designed to present general truths which everyone in that scientific area must know. But now, if you are doing a study of the genome of aircraft seats, the metagenome, which is the kind of thing that people do these days, then it may be that you don't want to have a reference ontology. You want to create a specific ontology just for Boeing seats, or for a new kind of Boeing plastic on the seats, or for an aerosol spray that Boeing introduced to keep the seats free of bacteria. Then you don't want to build a reusable ontology. You build an application ontology. And an application ontology is built the same way, by extending downwards. But now you're extending downwards and incorporating multiple ontologies. So an ontology of plastic, an ontology of aerosols, an ontology of seats, an ontology of seating behavior, I don't know, an ontology of bacterial formation through inadequate cleaning of aircraft seats, and so on. So you take ingredients from multiple reference ontologies and combine them for your specific application purpose. And when you do that, some of the principles which we have been emphasizing are no longer going to apply. So one principle is that all ontologies should be open, completely in the public domain, free. Anyone can use them for any purpose. But your application ontology may just be the Boeing cleaning department. Just for them. That's all. It's not. No one else will be interested in it. And in any case, they're going to keep it secret because they are playing it safe. Another example of a principle which we haven't talked about yet, but which is important. we talked about definitions. So an open system architecture is a system architecture which is open. And that's because open system architecture has the parent term system architecture. And so you know how to define it. You just take the parent term and formulate the specific difference. But you can only do that if there is only one parent term. And it could be that you have two parent terms. For instance, a multi-story car park is a car park and it's a building. And it may be that in your ontology you have both car parks and buildings, and then multi-story car park has two parents. Now, that's bad practice for reference ontology. But multiple parentage is going to be everywhere when you're dealing with application ontology. So reference ontologies are normalized. You get rid of all multiple parentage. For reasons of being able to write definitions according to our rule of definition, and for other reasons also. It's characteristically, people who build ontologies with multiple parentage make mistakes. It's just a source of error. And so we have a principle which says you should use single parentage, or sometimes called single inheritance. And so I'll give a toy example which is from artillery vehicle maintenance. So we define a vehicle as an object used for transporting people or goods. And then a tractor is a kind of vehicle, a crane is another kind of vehicle. A vehicle platform is what enables a vehicle to move. So it can be wheels or it can be track. So tanks have a track platform and lorries have a wheel platform. And these are all reference ontology terms, so it's all single inheritance. Every term has one parent. Now we have application ontology terms. An artillery vehicle it's not a good term for an ontology, because the very same vehicle might be an artillery vehicle one week and it might be a delivery vehicle the next week. And it might be a camouflaged explosive device the following week. It needn't even be a vehicle. So that's why we put it in the application ontology. The application ontology is for those terms which do not really capture the nature of the things that they're describing. They go in the reference ontology. Application ontologies are about specific uses or specific roles or specific circumstances. And so this is an application ontology created for the Delta battery artillery vehicle maintenance. And so the Delta battery has artillery vehicles and it has artillery tractors. And now our reference ontology is very simple. We have vehicles, tractors, and wheeled tractors. Every wheeled tractor is a tractor, every tractor is a vehicle. And we have another reference ontology which is taken over from military classifications which already exist. We have two kinds of components. We have those components which are field artillery, and then we have those basically which are stationary firing things in the field. So gun placement kinds of things. And then we have those things which move around, which are armor components, tanks, infantry components, and aviation components. So this is just the way the military divides up things like vehicles. That's a reference ontology too. But now we can link the two. So a wheeled tractor is used by a field artillery component. And in this way we can begin to create an application ontology. What are the artillery components? Sorry, what are the wheeled tractors which are used by the field artillery components? And what are the wheeled tractors which are used by the aviation components, for instance, to deliver petrol or something? So we have a new term, a wheeled tractor used by a field artillery component. That's an application ontology term. And now we can start having an instance. So the Delta battery has various field artillery components, and we take a photograph here. They are instances of the type field artillery component, and some of them are used by a wheeled tractor. And so we can put all of these ontology components together and we get this application ontology. It's an application ontology of delta battery artillery vehicles. And you can see that we don't anymore have single inheritance. We have lots of diamonds. And diamonds are fine for application ontologies, but they're not fine. This is a principle now. They're not fine for reference ontologies. All right, any questions about all of that? Yes?
So why exactly is it permissible for application ontology to do that? Because I'm thinking two different problems could arise. One, just like there could be a vagueness problem going from one kind of ontology to
Other perhaps, or you could another problem be you could have, I think maybe it's just in my head. You could have an application ontology that, as it gets further down the road, as the field develops, could be a reference ontology.
Good. All right, so first of all, you're right. People create an application ontology for pediatric endocrinology, for instance. They think they're just going to do one study. They need an ontology quickly, so they take the endocrinology ontology and they make pediatric terms. They build in terms relevant to their local population. But then they realize that they discover a really important new phenomenon and they need a reference ontology, so they clean up the application ontology and promote it to the level of reference ontology. That has happened. Now, why do we allow application ontologies? Because people are going to make quick and dirty ontologies anyway. And we give them two options. Either they make quick and dirty ontologies, which are, in the technical sense, crap, or we give them a way of building their application ontology and reusing as many components from reference ontologies that they can use, so that all the definitions and all the relations between those terms will be inherited, and they will, and that they can reuse the inference possibilities created by those relations. Other people can inspect what they do because they'll understand the reference ontologies because they're already using them. And so they get a benefit from observability from the outside. So this is a way of making people build quick and dirty ontologies which are not totally doomed to have a very short half-life.
Plus, another thing, I think we need to understand application ontology in a specific way, that is really information system application, and not confuse it with domain ontology.
Yeah.
So when you said if you have this ontology which is to be applied in pediatric oncology, that does not make it an application ontology.
No.
It needs to be used in a
Yeah.
specific. Okay, then we agree on that, which is in.
Yep.
So in a perfect world where everyone was just a trained ontologist, we wouldn't need application ontologies. You could just, everything that you could do with an application ontology, you could do with a reference ontology?
No, I don't think so. So the US Department of Defense has tried to build a general human resources ontology for the entire Department of Defense. And that is going to contain a whole series of application-specific subtypes which are going to need to be controlled and managed on a daily basis because as the laws, the instructions, the directives change, the way in which the Army and the Navy and the Space Force divide up their personnel will change. And so you're dealing with application ontology types of classification, as well as with generic classification. You're still going to distinguish between retired personnel, active personnel, reserve personnel. Reserve personnel on active duty will be a role that they play for a certain time. So there'll be some reference ontology components, but some application ontology components. And it will always be like that for those kinds of cases.
Or another thing is that in our sense, in an ontology, there should never be references to instances. And for certain application ontologies, it might, specifically geography or some social things, it might be more convenient to have there Europe, America in your ontology.
Yeah.
Okay, for
Or
application
Delta
ontology, you can do that.
Delta factory, isn't it?
Yeah, but there is more than one, right? Oh, no, that's
Delta
one
factory
specific,
is
one instance.
specific
Okay.
Unit. Yeah.
So he sort of answered part of my question, but so relations like used by and instance of, are those just primarily used in application ontologies or
no.
only used in bio?
So instance of links the world of instances, which is beneath the ontologies, with the world of ontology. And used by can occur both on the instance level. This mouse is used by Barry Smith, and on the type level, mouse used by computer user.
Okay.
So, and then it's a different relation. The used by on the instance level is a different relation from the used by on the type level, although they are, of course, related in just the same way that Barry Smith is related to the type human being. I'm an instance of that.
So you'd use the general one. You'd have the used by in the general sense. You know, computer mouse used by computer user in a general ontology.
Yeah, right.
But if you were doing a specific ontology where a specific application ontology where, like, you're talking about instances of...
No, so you're still referring to what is general, but your reference to what is general involves a limitation to a certain subset. So there is the term cancer patient, and then there is the term cancer patient who is currently a patient of Roswell Park Cancer Institute. That is still a general type because there are still thousands of patients who are patient of Roswell Park Cancer Institute. But the type involves reference to an individual. Just as the Delta battery wheeled artillery tractor involves reference to an individual, but they may have hundreds of tractors. So it's the reference to an individual which makes the difference. All ontologies are about types according to the principles that we accept. And instances are beneath the ontology. And we're very interested in the instances because we can only observe the instances. We can only do experiments with instances. But we're interested in the laws governing the instances, which are on the level of types.
That's a discussion for next week, right? So that next week is basic formal ontology, right?
Yeah.
In detail, yes. So that will be covered there more.
Not next week. Next week is later.
Well, yeah, the week after.
Next real week. Yes?
So the general version of the relation used by or is that an ontology too?
So we have something called the relation ontology, which consists of an ontology of all of these relations.
Okay.
It's a bit different from the other ontologies because the relation ontology it links ontologies to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to find out who's going to be managing because all of the ontologies which it links have their own managers. That's the relation ontology is the orphan of ontological authority. Because everyone wants it, but no one wants to be responsible for it. But we'll come back to that in due course. All right, so I talked about the gene ontology starting with the terminologies used by different groups of scientists studying different model organisms. They came together and created a species-neutral vocabulary. Now, because they moved to a higher level of generality, this meant that they were performing an act of future-proofing. The reason being that when they did this, there were maybe 10 genomes which had been decoded, genomes of 10 different organisms. Now there are thousands. The gene ontology still works because it moved to a level of generality which was species-neutral, so whatever genomes are thrown at the gene ontology, it will still work. Now that's a general rule, that you future-proof an ontology by making sure that you're at a higher level of generality than the data that you already have. That's a principle, which we haven't written down in the book. I'm going to write it down at some stage. Maybe you will write it down in your presentation. The reason why I'm emphasizing this principle is because it's a principle which almost all ontology efforts so far ignore. In the following sense, they have data which comes from some cancer experiment or from some military planning database. They want an ontology. So they build an ontology for that data. And then 3 weeks later, they want to have more data from somewhere else incorporated, and the ontology doesn't work anymore. So they say, oh, ontologies, they never work. When we build an ontology, we always say, well, where do these things fit? How do they relate to the next general level? And how does that next general level relate to other ontologies on that level? So we always think about the next highest level of generality. So I'm involved in a project to study cognition of intelligence analysts. And we have a lot of data about single intelligence analysts. But we don't have any data about how intelligence analysts work together in teams or how they use computers. And so the manager of this project said, well, let's just make an ontology for single intelligence analysts. And I got angry with him, and I said, and then next week we'll have to rebuild it because we didn't take account of teams. And so we built it so that we have cognitive process, and then we have individual cognitive process, team cognitive process involving computer assistance, and so on. And so all of these things will be managed at the same time. We have the most data for the individual processes, so we'll build that branch of the ontology at the beginning in more detail, but we'll always have the remaining branches of the ontology ready when we get data about teams and so forth. So you can think of building an ontology as being a bit like building a road network. So when you have to build some road first, but when you plan the road network, as soon as you start building, you will also be planning for roads which will be built in the future. You'll be leaving room for bridges and intersections and so on, even though the roads to be built in the future may not be built in your lifetime. Well, with ontologies, it's the same way. The way in which you leave room for bridges and intersections is by moving to the next level.
So at that point when you got angry to that guy, you were again a philosopher. Because an engineer or an information technology consultant would have said, sure, doing this, that's $1 million. Next week another, that's another $1 million. And next week you read another, that's another $1 million.
So philosophers are defined by being poor. All right. Now, then the question is, and this is not a very clear slide, if future-proofing means rising up to an ever higher level of generality, what happens when you reach the very top? And the answer is BFO. That's what BFO is. It's the top-level ontology. And you can see it here. So this is the gene ontology. The gene ontology is made of 3 sub-ontologies. One is for cell parts, one is for molecular functions, and one is for biological processes. So biological processes are things like cell division. Molecular functions are things like when one protein binds to another protein. And cellular components are things like nucleus, membrane, and so forth. So there are 3 top nodes to the gene ontology, and there are 3 top nodes to BFO, namely independent continuant, dependent continuant, and occurrent. Cellular components are independent continuants, which means roughly things. Molecular functions are dependent continuants, which means roughly attributes. And biological processes are occurrents, which means roughly the things that occur. These are things which exist in time. Those are things which occur in time. And I'll explain the meanings of
Can you go to the previous slide? Can you say something about those numbers?
Yes, so the gene ontology is very large, or it's medium large. It has about 50,000 terms. And to keep track of those terms over time, each one has the noun or noun phrase, which is the term, together with the ID number. And you have an ID number because if you change the definition of a term, then you will change the ID number so that people will know which definition is relevant when they see a particular application of ontology to some data from the past. And also sometimes terms are deprecated, which means that people realize that they don't actually correspond to what we know biologically, and so you deprecate the term. You want to keep the term, but you want to make it clear that it's not a term that's recommended for use anymore. And because the term is kept with its tracking number, you can have the complete set of gene ontology terms. You can just present those terms which are in active use and have the deprecated terms invisible, or you can see also the deprecated terms along with the terms which are recommended for actual use. And use now means the following. There is a whole career track called biocurator. There are hundreds of people who have biocurator as their profession. They are PhD biologists who are spending their working day reading papers published in biology journals, and to some degree also studying databases, including databases published as part of papers. That's increasingly common in biology now. And tagging what they read using the gene ontology terms. So this particular phrase here is about nucleotide binding, and so they tag that term, they tag that sentence in the paper with the gene ontology term, with the number and then the term, and they create what's called an annotation. And so they now have a gigantic annotation database which consists of hundreds of thousands of papers which have been tagged using the gene ontology. And now you can search through all of those papers using the gene ontology in all kinds of clever ways. So you can search for all the papers relating to tumors in the brains of shrimp who have been subjected to mercury poisoning, I don't know, in all the literature. And you may find only 4 papers about that, but you will find them because of the gene ontology annotation database, which is an amazing achievement because it provides a baseline for what is common and standard. So you can use the gene ontology annotation database to find out what the standard gene expression will be for a healthy lung in an adult male. And then if you find that your patient's lung has a gene expression which differs from this baseline, then you know that there's something wrong or something right if they're extremely healthy. And a lot of work in diagnosis on the basis of analyses of gene expression, for instance, in different samples from organisms, uses the gene ontology as an underlying source of statistical information. All right. So this is BFO at the very top. Continuants are things which continue, which exist in time. Occurrence are things which occur. Some continuants are self-standing, they're independent. For instance, organisms, planets, baseballs, laptops, arms, groups of people, and then some continuants depend on independent continuants. For instance, qualities such as temperature, functions such as the function to screw screws, which is the function of a certain screwdriver. And then occurrence are things which happen to independent continuants, for instance, dying or smiling. So these are some more examples. And this is BFO, the whole of BFO. So you can see independent continuant. Now we have 2 kinds of dependent continuant because BFO has become a little bit more complex since the gene ontology. We have processes which are kinds of occurrence. We have process boundaries which are kinds of occurrence. And then we have temporal and spatiotemporal regions which are kinds of occurrence. And I won't go through the rest. One thing I will mention just for Werner's sake. So originally, well, I'll explain it in full so that everyone else can get what Werner will see as being a pleasing consequence and what you will see as just boring information. So we have independent continuants, some of which are made of matter, some of which are not made of matter. An example would be a site, like this room, for instance. The interior of this room is a place where things happen. It's not made of anything, but it's not an attribute, and it's not a process. It's a site, it's a place, a whole with an H. But there are other kinds of immaterial independent continuants which are what we call continuant fiat boundaries. And they're basically the boundaries of things. So my boundary, the boundary of my body, is a continuant fiat boundary. And we used to call these things zero-dimensional continuant fiat boundaries, which would be the North Pole. One-dimensional fiat boundary, continuant fiat boundaries, which would be the equator. Two-dimensional continuant fiat boundaries, which would be the plane separating the no smoking from the smoking zone of this restaurant. And sites, which are three-dimensional fiat-y things. Now we renamed those things. Now they're called fiat point boundaries, fiat line boundaries, fiat surface boundaries, and sites. Sites keeps its name. That's one of the changes that we're making with the ISO standardization. It was our idea. It wasn't an ISO idea. There are some changes which came from ISO, but that one was just a simplification. All right, that was a very quick survey of what is not really very large, but seeing it for the first time, you might think that it's too large to be gone over quickly. Yes?
I was just curious whether states go anywhere.
State is a very good question. So the word state is used by a lot of our customers. That's a lot of people who use BFO want to use the word state. We do not know of what should be the correct definition of state, and so we don't use it. There are various options. So BFO has quality, and very often what people mean by the state is equality. But it certainly doesn't fit with many uses of state. But we can talk about that. That would be a very good topic for a presentation. Yes.
So all of these terms have separate definitions somewhere?
Well, when you're dealing with terms of such high level of generality, it may be that there is no more general term which you can use to define it. And for instance, the term entity is not defined.
Oh, okay.
We could define continuant as meaning an entity which continues to exist. That would be a good definition for some purposes, but we don't think it's a good definition for our purposes because continuant and continued are really the same root, and so it's circular. But we give the elucidation, which is circular, but which has lots of examples, and then axioms. So many of the terms on the board here are defined. Some of them just have elucidation.
So, but if you look at that schema, is there something that you are a little bit wondering about or surprised about?
Just in terms of what a process boundary is or a temporal region, like a process, I understand what that is under the occurrence, but the other three,
a process boundary is a beginning or an ending.
Oh, okay.
The start of the race. So these are.
Okay.
It could be thresholds for the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
That was a boundary. Actually, that's probably a temporal region boundary.
Something else in relation to that slide with architecture, system architecture?
I am wondering why dependent continuant isn't generically dependent continuant, and specifically aren't just children of dependent continuant, like
yes.
the
So
architecture.
Yeah, good question. That means I don't have an answer.
Okay.
So generically dependent continuant is something like a sequence or a PDF file on your laptop. It's generically dependent because it has to have some memory device or some carrier. It doesn't have to have that unique laptop. You can copy it. A specifically dependent continuant is specifically dependent on some specific bearer, such as the head, which is the bearer of your head.
I think, was it not because originally there was dependent continuant,
Yeah.
but it was then understood only as specifically
Yeah,
dependent
that's right.
continuant?
Exactly. So there was a reason. He is very interested in reasons for changes.
Yeah, that's one of my domains. So.
He uses that to measure the quality of an ontology. If an ontology has been subject, if a term in an ontology has been subject to more than 300 changes, it's probably a bad ontology.
So the way it is done now, okay, so originally there was dependent continuant, but actually it meant specifically dependent continuant. So it would have been bad practice to keep dependent continuant and actually change the meaning as being something which is now more general than specifically dependent continuant. Okay? So most people would do that, which is not good. So now there was no change in interpretation possible.
So another common mistake when people build ontologies, or when they build terminologies in the concept orientation mode, is that they use words like other. So you have diabetes as your general term, and then you have diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2, diabetes type 3, and then you have other diabetes. That is bad practice. And it's bad practice because as soon as they discover diabetes type 4, then all the old annotations using other diabetes will become unusable because no one will know whether they were. So you should never use the other. It's very tempting to do that. If you're late.
Doctors like it. That's why it's abundant in biomedical systems.
Yeah.
So in that kind of scenario, if you were trying to talk about a diabetes that does not seem like it's type 1 or
Yeah.
type 2 or 3 or whatever, would you just cite the parent?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You cite the lowest term that you can cite correct. And then you can add a note if you're a doctor. You can add a note saying it is not. It is known that this is not type 1 or type 2 or type 3. So that the other is not an assertion about the entity, it's an assertion about your knowledge. All you know about the entity is diabetes. And then you have some negative knowledge. And that's information about you, what you know, not information about the entity. So SNOMED has, I guess still has, terms like absent nipple.
Oh, they have been removed.
So yet another
The absent nipple has been removed.
No, there were lots of those things. But there are still a couple of mistakes in that area. So, for instance, there is still, the equivalent, no headache is still there. And no headache is a kind of no pain, which is of course wrong, because you might have pain in your foot. It's not the case when you have no headache, then you cannot conclude that you don't have no pain. And that's one of the problems there. They introduced, which is going to be a topic of one of my note papers now, they introduced disposition in the latest version. And now you have enzyme, molecule, enzyme, disposition. And like 362 of those.
So you see, disposition is here. And so we are very vocal. So we infect people by teaching them that certain terms are to be used in certain ways.
But then they apply it wrongly, because
sometimes they use it
half
right.
of the dispositions that I already saw are actually functions.
Well, that's not, so functions are a subtype of disposition.
Yeah, but
That might be-
SNOMED has function too. They are not under function.
Okay. So I don't need to go over that. So now the hub and spokes idea caught on, and now there are more ontology suites. So the OVO is the first ontology suite, the first one with some kind of success. Now we have the common core ontologies, which are an ontology suite maintained here in Buffalo by people in Kubrick. Does everyone know what Kubrick is? Kubrick is a research facility in front of the airport. There is a long, incredibly long brick building in front of the airport, which is populated in large part by Kubrick and related organizations who do research, often involving usually faculty, but often involving military funding. And they have an ontology team which created this suite of ontologies called the common core ontologies, which are very generic. They're about time-space events, ethnicities, money, and so forth. And they're used by various military organizations. And they have BFO, like all the other suites here, they have BFOs at top level. And then we have the Industrial Ontologies Foundry, which is a collection of ontologies that we're building at the moment, along with various industrial partners and various universities, for industrial data management. And so this is a not very well designed slide showing how the Industrial Ontologies Foundry might look. And we have everything you see here, we have in some form. This is the common core ontologies. This is a product lifecycle ontology. This is a machine and tool ontology. These are various materials ontologies. And then we have manufacturing process ontology. They all use BFO, but they're not yet mature, so they're still works in progress.
What is SLAC about?
SLAC is laminated something.
That's not trousers.
No. So there are different ways of doing manufacturing now. There's additive manufacturing, which is 3D printing. There's functionally graded material creation, which is a more complicated version of 3D printing. And then there is laminated material, which is putting layers together at different with different orientations or otherwise different, so that it gets stronger or lighter or more resistant to temperature changes and so on. And Kebi is the chemistry ontology, which was developed as part of OVO. All right, now I'm going to do a little bit more philosophical stuff. So here speaks Professor Husserl of his own scientific achievement. That's Edmund Husserl. So I said nothing happened between Aristotle and Tom Gruber, Patrick Hayes, but that's not quite true. In 2013, the second edition of Husserl's Logical Investigations were published. So Husserl was a philosopher who founded a movement called Phenomenology, which became very influential in the 20th century. And he started off as a mathematician, and his Logical Investigations is a contribution to what we would now call philosophical logic / cognitive science. So it's about logic on the one hand and about cognition, evidence, thinking, reasoning, and so forth on the other hand. The third logical investigation has the title On the Theory of Wholes and Parts. And in this third logical investigation, there is the following passage. A deeper grounding of the distinction in independent dependent continuance leads directly to the fundamental questions of the pure theory of wholes and parts, which belongs to formal ontology. Now, that is the first occurrence in philosophical literature of the term formal ontology. Now remember, basic formal ontology also has the term formal ontology. So basic formal ontology grew in no small part out of this text, the third logical investigation, which includes axioms for part and whole relation. for instance, the axiom of transitivity, that if A is part of B, and B is part of C, then A is part of C. And so Husserl's idea was that Lesniewski was the first person who formalized the entire logic of parts and wholes as a formal theory. Husserl had some axioms, but he didn't formalize it as a complete theory. And that there is a little bit of influence between Husserl and Lesniewski. But they both had the same idea that the theory of parts and wholes should be the basis for something like a realist ontology of the very general structures of reality. So we're not now doing biology or physics or chemistry, we're doing something at a much more general level. Part-whole relations are very general. You will find them in every domain. So a formal ontology is an ontology of those structures that you find in every domain, where a domain ontology is an ontology of those structures which you just find in some specific domain, such as biology or cell biology, muscle cell biology. Now, Husserl had a theory of universals, he had a theory of topology, he had a theory of relations, and he had a theory of dependent entities. Lesniewski had some of this, but not all of it. And all of this is part of BFO in one way or another. So it's not all of topology, he has some topology. So topology means boundaries and continuity, when one thing is continuous from one place or time to another. Relations, we know what they are. Dependent entities, we know what they are. Things like headaches and PDF files. And universals, we've been calling kinds or types, as contrasted with instances. So a lot of what Husserl was doing was already there. A lot of what we are doing in basic formal ontology was already there in 1913, or even in 1901 when he wrote these things down in the first version, but without using the term formal ontology. They were already there in Husserl. And Husserl made an explicit comparison between formal logic and formal ontology, which is interesting. And he meant by formal something like what we mean, namely domain neutral. He talked about region, not domain, but he meant the same thing. Now he didn't say this, but this was what he meant. If we have a really good top-level formal ontology, a highly general domain-neutral ontology, then we should be able to save time building reference ontologies for all the domains at lower levels. And that proves to be true, so we can prove that now empirically. So formal ontology is the theory not just of part-whole, but of other ontological structures. So he talked about unity, plurality, number, state of affairs, and so forth. And again, each of these can be found in every single domain that you care to consider. Every domain of reality. And his idea of ontological dependence is what motivates the BFO idea of ontological dependence. So you can't have a color without having something which is extended in space. You can't have a charge without a conductor. You can't have a speech act without a speaker. So again, it's not rocket science that we're doing here. These things are, in some sense, weaker in being than these things. These things are made of matter. They're independent. They're self-standing. Where these things need these other things in order to exist. That's how we understand interdependence. Now, Husserl had various students, and the first group of students were assembled in Munich and Göttingen, and then they moved. Some of them moved to Poland. One of them became Pope. Another one became a saint. Actually, both of them became saints. There are two saints on this list.
Which one became the Pope?
This one.
Karl Wojtyla. Which is the other one?
Edith Stein. She is a saint.
Saint?
Yeah. She was she died in Auschwitz. She was a Jew and she converted to Catholicism and performed miracles.
Like what?
Oh, I'm not sure you should believe it when they say it, so I won't tell you. She was a very clever student of Husserl, and he didn't give her a job because she was a woman. So she's now a hero of feminism. She's the first feminist hero. Now, Adolf Reinach invented speech act theory in 1913, for instance. And Roman Ingarden did more than anyone else to develop formal ontology and domain ontology in the spirit of Husserl than anyone else. He was a true realist. But Husserl, gradually, as he became older, ceased to be a realist in the full sense. So, this group, the Munich, Göttingen, Krakow school, extended Husserl's formal ontology. They applied it to different areas. So Fender applied it to will, Scheler to ethics, Reinach to law and speech acts, as we said. Edith Stein applied it to the state. Ingarden applied it to the ontology of art and literature, and also did a lot of work in general ontology. And then Wojtyła applied it to areas like freedom and conscience. And Ingarden then wrote a huge work, which is now finally translated into English after a long time. It's called The Controversy Over the Existence of the World, in 3 volumes. And it's devoted to 3 kinds of ontology: formal ontology, material ontology, and existential ontology. Existential ontology is about the difference between dependence and independence, and unity and disunity. Material ontology is primarily about causality and the realm of the cause. And then formal ontology is about part, whole, and the like. And it's very, very detailed working out of Husserl's original ideas about ontology, but extended into quite new areas. And a really good example of Ingarden's new contributions is in his account of what a system is, causal system. And that's a picture of it. So